Hey everyone, Reaper here again with another video, another discussion video. I wanted to talk a little bit today about coming back to the hobby. Some of us who are in, well, I should say some people in the hobby, comic book collecting hobby, they have been in it since the early 70s, 60s, 80s, and have been collecting nonstop. I've always been a collector. For some of us that have been in the hobby, not always the case. Some of us left for a few years or collected very little or had other things going on in our lives that created gaps in our collecting. And then we eventually came back for this reason or that reason. Sometimes life happens or other things go on that take you out of your hobbies, comic book collecting included. So, I began collecting when I was an early teen. I enjoyed the small-time cons that I would go to that were mainly in not hotel lobbies, but they had these hotel dining rooms and all that stuff, or conference rooms or whatever they were. But I've always enjoyed myself, I was collecting video games. I'll talk about video games in a moment, but I collected video games, mainly played them, but when I bought them, I kept them in pretty good shape, so maybe I was collecting and not even knowing it. So when I got into comic book collecting, it was really a different world. A different world in a sense that, you could actually go to a convention and look around and see comic books that came out decades earlier. I mean, that was so cool. Back in the early 90s, we didn't have that when it came to video games, or at least from my memory. I don't remember video game conventions, and I don't remember being able to go get an older video game that came out in the mid-'80s unless it was at Toys R Us. If Toys R Us didn't have it, or another type of store that would sell games, if they didn't have it, you couldn't get it. There was no eBay or anything like that. But with a comic book convention, you could collect the new comics that were coming out at the time, like Maximum Carnage or all that other stuff. But you can still go to these cons, and there were big ones back then that I was unaware of, and smaller ones like the ones that I would go to, and you could get, well, gee, I want to see if I get the first appearance of Venom. I'm not going to go to, I could go to my local shop and see if they have the first appearance of Venom, but if they don't have it, I could also go to a con and get it. So it was really cool for me. It was a really cool time in the collecting in my life when it came to collecting comics and other things and stuff like that. So it was also around that time, and like I said, video games were in my life too, but they predated comic book collecting for about 5 years. I started collecting in '93 comics, and I started collecting games, or buying games rather, in 1988 with the Nintendo, and gradually by 1993 I had the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis, in addition to the original Nintendo and a Game Boy. So I was into the Nintendo world and to the Genesis world. I was mainly into the Nintendo world because I liked what they had better than Sega. But regardless, I was exposed to both, and I had games for both systems, and I kept them in pretty good shape back then, and I still have them today. But I was gaming around that time too, so one of my favorites was, of course, this. As you can see, it still has the wrapper on it. Like I said, I kept them in pretty good shape. I wrote number 15. That was my 15th Super Nintendo game, and I had this yellow marker. But the boxes, they're a little crushed, but they still have the cellophane on them and all the other goodies inside. So, like I said, I kept them in pretty good shape. But I enjoyed games like Zelda. All these games I got when they first came out. I didn't get them years later. And of course, Super Metroid's in better shape than my Zelda. But being that when I entered the comic book world, I started saying, hey, I want to get some of those comic book games, right? Started taking an interest in that. So my comic book collecting started to influence my video game collecting. And so, of course, I wanted to get this game, Spider-Man, X-Men, and Arcade's Revenge. Sucked. I went and got the Incredible Hulk. Difficult game, but I really enjoyed it. the death and the return of Superman. This is like a beat 'em up game, so that was really cool. You get to be all four Supermen, and you go through all the chapters and eventually fight the cyborg Superman at the end. Of course, you fight Doomsday in the beginning when you die and all that stuff. And of course, just another one, X-Men Mutant Apocalypse. I have others. I like Maximum Carnage and all that stuff, but that's just to show you like how when I first entered the comic book hobby, it influenced my gaming and all that stuff. But I also mentioned earlier, you know, there are gaps in my collecting. You know, it's about coming back to the hobby, this video, right? So after those first few years, you know, life happened. You know, I went to college and I started having other interests, and comic book collecting was sort of put on the side. You know, it took a back seat for a long time. You know, I remember back then, right before I stopped collecting for a while, I was like, wow, I would have loved to have seen a Spider-Man movie, or I would have loved to have seen an X-Men movie. That would have been great. This is sort of me back in 1994, 95 saying this. But then after that, I was like, it sort of just went away. And my video game collecting really took off with the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn and all that stuff. So even though I still liked comics, I would still go to a comic book store with a friend. Really wasn't buying anything anymore, you know. So that lasted for many, many years. And when I came back to the hobby, this was before I came back to the hobby, I noticed that all of these comic book movies were coming out. I remember seeing Iron Man with my fiance or girlfriend, who's now my wife. Back then, I said, "You want to go see Iron Man?" I remember Iron Man. I mean, I can't believe he had his own movie come out, but no, let's go see Iron Man. I was like, wow, that was pretty good. And started seeing all these Marvel movies come out, because Marvel movies, up until 2008, you know, I mean, yeah, I liked the X-Men movies, I liked Blade, but there really wasn't a strong consistency of quality in Marvel movies back then. It wasn't until the Marvel Cinematic Universe started, and granted, some Marvel Cinematic Universe movies are not as good as others, right? You know, it's just the way it is, matter of opinion. But it wasn't until those movies started coming out, I was like, wow, I'd like to get back into this hobby. And I finally did. And one of the things I said is, you know, a book that I've always wanted to get when I was younger, and at the time I was able to finally get it. When I came back to the hobby, I said, I'm going to get this book. And I did. And it was X-Men #1. Not this particular copy. This is my second copy. You know, both were low grade. But this was one of the first books I got when I came back to the hobby. When I came back, I said, you know, I want to go right for X-Men. I want to be just an X-Men collector and, you know, get back into it. And of course, that didn't last. I started reaching out into Batman and all that stuff. But yeah, this was the first thing I went out and got. I bought myself a raw copy. It turned out to be a 3.0, just like this one. Not as nice looking as this one. You know, there's 3.0 and then there's 3.0, right? But that was one of the first books I purchased. And then as time went on, a short amount of time, I purchased a couple things. And yes, I did get Blade, the first appearance of Blade, because I enjoyed the movies. I liked the first two. The third one was like, not bad, but And I remember, like, yeah, I'd like to get some of these books that I knew of. I knew of the characters when I first got into the hobby. And I also know that they had movies somewhere down the line. And I wanted to get them, and Blade was one of them. And one of the big ones for me to get, one book that I got kicked off of eBay for back in 2001 that I wanted to get, and I finally got, soon when I entered the hobby again, was this one, X-Men '94. I don't know if I told this story. Back in 2001, I was on eBay, and like many people were. And I was buying a lot of different things. eBay was really cool. And one of the things that I purchased was X-Men '94. I think I spent like $120 on it. And I don't even know what grade it was. And I said to myself, man, I ain't going to buy that. I ain't going to give this guy money. So I got kicked off of eBay for it. And eventually I came right back. I created a new profile, and which is the one that I've had ever since. It's just a funny story. How back in 2001, really wasn't in the comic book hobby, but I was somehow looking up comic books. I was like, oh, maybe I'll get this. But one of the books I wanted was this. And when I officially came back to the hobby, I was able to finally get a nice, it was about maybe an 8.0 copy of X-Men '94. So it was really cool to be back in the hobby. It felt good. you know. And ever since that time I came back, I've been in it ever since. No signs of going away, you know. And it's been nice to finally get some of the books that I was unable to get many years ago. I mean, look, there is a lot of books I was able to get over the last couple of years that I've wanted, but it took me a while to get because there are just a lot of books. I can't get them all at once. So I got to pace myself each year of when I'm going to get. It's a really good experience to do. And it's why I'm, still in the hobby. It's it's an enjoyable hobby. So that was me coming back to the hobby. A lot of factors made me want to come back. The movies were definitely an interest because, it's right front and center. The things that you liked as a kid that you wanted. I would have loved, like I said, I would love to have seen an X-Men movie back in '94. It didn't come out till 2000. And when it came out in 2000, I was like, whatever. But when I started seeing the movies and really started to get into it and just remembering these characters and wondering, what's the sequel going to have? Is Mr. Sinister going to be in it? Really sparked that interest. And Comic Book Man, the Kevin Smith show, that also helped when people were actually coming into the store trying to sell comics, or they were selling comics. I'm like, yeah, I have that one. I remember having that one. Ooh, I'd like to get that one. So it's a bunch of things that really brought me back, and I'm glad that I've been back for all these years. So anybody out there have a similar story, like you were a collector way back when and you left the hobby for whatever reason? Like I said, life happens. Maybe you got married. Maybe, unfortunately, there might have been a death in the family. Maybe you just lost interest. Maybe you had interest in other things. Who knows? But came back after a while. If you have any of those stories, please share them in the comments. And I thank you for watching. Take care, everyone.